Right, well, I've already recorded a fucking review today, but for some reason, the webcam that I only recently purchased and paid over the odds for due to fucking COVID put it out of sync. And I don't know why I let this annoy me enough to re-record a fucking review for you bastards, but I do. It annoys me, even though everything we do is futile and pointless. We're forever condemned to think that there's a reason and meaning behind everything, when in fact there is not. Here I am again, fucking reviewing a book I've already just done. But if it makes you feel any better, I have just eaten. I had prawns and scrambled eggs with rice on a bed of spinach and other green things with a bit of mayonnaise, and it was nice. I have a bit of energy now. The coffee I've been consuming in abundance in the morning doesn't really seem to be doing its job. And even with an additional Red Bull, I seem to be knackered a lot of the time, which is weird, right? Who would have thought? Who would have thunk it that over fucking consumption of caffeine would actually make you feel knackered? But there you go. Actually, I will address something else, which I did in the previous review as well. Yeah, well, sometimes you guys recommend me a book, and I've never heard of it. And in those instances, I want to express my gratitude, so I normally mention it in a textual format at the beginning or somewhere in the middle of the review, just as a little nod of my thanks. But also, sometimes I also get recommended books that I have heard of. And when I've already got it on the back burner, I'm already aware of it, you know, on the outskirts of my consciousness or whatever you want to call it. It feels a bit unnecessary to give any mention to it, because all it really is a reminder or a kind of hint that you guys want me to review it. So in those cases, I'm not actually going to mention anything. Which brings me to The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Well, firstly, just look at that cover. Fucking beautiful that is. My favourite of the Everyman covers, I would say. Normally they put the guy's face on the front of it, or the woman's in those cases. But with this one, they've just gone for a really gloomy kind of atmosphere, and I just think it looks amazing. It really invites you in, ironically, even though it's a bit daunting and ominous. But yeah, really nice. And right, this one was first published back in the very latter end of the 19th century, which I think was originally in serialized format. I assume delivered in 3 parts, much like the novella is, and wasn't actually published in book format until 1902. I will note here as well that this was published around 5 or 4 years, I think it was in 1896, where a group of colonial white boys gathered around and fucking basically divided the continent of Africa up for their own amusement, assumedly, and just went, well, this part goes here, and this is where the line divides, and that one goes there, and this one goes here. And there was no African influence in it whatsoever. Nothing. None at all. There was no say, no representative, nothing. Just fucking white people dividing up a country like some deformed piece of pie for themselves, and just said, this is where that goes, this is where this is, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And previously, before that, Africa was actually doing pretty well for itself. It was quite a thriving, prosperous continent. And then the white man turned up and went, we can't have none of this. Let's fucking ruin the place. And yeah, after that, it was pretty much destroyed. As we do. The funny thing about what's going on at the moment, I would say, is that it gives off a kind of idea that people are only just becoming aware of how fucking horrific humanity really is. And of how basically wherever they've gone, they've destroyed and pillaged and raped and wiped out species, not only the subhuman parts of our own species, but of other species as well. So all of this kind of riffraff that's going on at the moment, I kind of feels a bit, not necessarily redundant, but it feels a little bit wanting. It's almost like, dude, just look through human history. Like, everyone is a cunt. There's no like redeeming quality to it. You know, it's just the same thing over and over again, with different elements, different ways of judging it, different technological advances or disadvantages that obviously feed in to the consequences of its time as well. So, I mean, in some ways I'm all for it, but the way people go about it, I'm well against. I'm just like, this is fucking stupid, you know. But again, at the same time, maybe everything that's going on right now is almost like an overdue reaction. And in some ways, although I understand the reasons behind it, I don't necessarily agree with the manner it's being carried out. But that's all I'm really going to mention of our contemporary modern nightmare dystopia of a world that we're living in. I can't be bothered to pay much further attention to it. So, Heart of Darkness. Yeah, I mean, if you're a reader or you have interest in books, you've most likely heard of Heart of Darkness. When it first came out in the late 19th century, it kind of didn't really do much, actually. It kind of just sat around. No one really gave it much critical acclaim. Some people actually kind of, they didn't really think anything of it, to be honest. And I can kind of understand why. It was only really brought to light, let's say, once it went around academic circles and it was put forward for study, really, and of examination and of what it was trying to say, I suppose. But in terms of like entertainment, it's a struggle. I would say that is probably due to, if you go into it blind, like I mostly did. I mean, I was aware of it, but I wasn't really sure of what the story was. I only really knew that it kind of got into the inherent darkness of mankind, which is kind of given away in the title anyway, and that it was something to do with the Congo, with colonialism, with excavations for ivory, that kind of thing. And I didn't really know much else. I kind of assumed it would have a kind of Melvillian kind of aspect where, you know, kind of the characters might speak a bit like they do in Moby Dick, maybe. But that's about it. I didn't really know anything else. I also didn't even know that Apocalypse Now is essentially a retelling of Heart of Darkness, except they take the location away from the Congo and dump it into Vietnam. Again, where there's a bunch of white people who don't fucking belong there, getting up to no good, ruining cultures, raping women. You know, the usual thing the white man gets up to. And then he called that his own burden. The white man's burden. Brilliant. That's probably one of my favourite expressions, actually. Just through the sheer arrogance and conceitedness of it. It's almost a satire, just saying it. The white man's burden, that he has to go and travel to these places he's never been to before and educate the savage peoples of these fucking cultures that he has no clue about or doesn't understand or whatever. Just has to, like a way a religion does, Christianity is especially good at this, of just forcing their dogma on cultures, and if they don't take to it, they fucking, you know, slaughter them, basically. There's a history lesson for you. Cunts. We're all arseholes. And I think Conrad actually would agree with me. But anyway, I'll briefly go over the plot, which is brief enough as it is, I found. We are basically introduced to the story by a unnamed narrator who is there on a ship on the Thames, or a kind of boat, and they're gathering around to listen to a character called Marlowe, who is the real narrator of the story. So we're kind of very quickly put into a story within a story, which I enjoy as a literary merit. It's one of those things that I think is probably because Shakespeare stole it left, right and centre and implemented it quite frequently throughout his plays. And there is something about it that's quite intriguing. I don't know why. It kind of puts you into you feel like a participant and an observer simultaneously, which I quite enjoy. Plus, I do think within this piece, it actually added to the ominous kind of otherworldliness of the atmosphere that is referenced to voluminously, shall we say. The symbolism in this is what usually is talked about throughout. And I wasn't really sure whether that was to the detriment of it as a story or to its behoovement. I couldn't really divide the two, mainly because it kind of made it a struggle to read. It wasn't the most pleasurable experience trying to get into this piece. With the dialect difficulties aside, those are kind of easily overcome once you get used to the story. But when you just want to be kind of swept away into a kind of escapist viewpoint and to be, journeyed along yourself and to enjoy it. And I found the disruptions in the narrative throughout this piece, which Marlowe often does, to be a little bit jarring at times and to kind of peter away from the story a little bit. However, as a literary merit, it worked quite well. And I mainly put this down to Conrad using it as a way of criticising storytelling in essence, or at least highlighting the limitations of storytelling. There's quite a few nice passages where Marlowe interrupts his own story to try and actually ask the people who are listening to him, which in essence is us, although it is also his audience within the story, about kind of just saying, are you keeping up? Am I being followed here? Is the emotion and the sheer horror of the situation being palpably demonstrated and conveyed? And a lot of the time he kind of concludes that it isn't. And I do think there is an element there that's really discussing the limitations of literature and of storytelling and of art maybe as well. And it highlights what I perceived as a very nihilistic worldview of Conrad's, actually, and how he just didn't really find much merit in humanity and of existence as a human being, which is also depicted in this manner where, due to the conclusions of Marlowe, who is his alter ego, I would say, he uses him multiple times in other novels. Lord Jim is another big one, which features Marlowe. But he kind of concludes that whether or not something can be conveyed perfectly through words, it will never be described in the same manner as which it is felt. So there is something about your own history and the palpability of a certain moment that is only relatable to yourself, and you're alone with it, essentially. Much like in dreams, you're alone with your own kind of extraordinary experiences, which is quite a fatalistic, if not very nihilistic viewpoint, and one that I kind of agree with overall, as savage as it really is. It's kind of unavoidable. And I think that actually added to the kind of dead weight of the piece as well. Like, everything feels kind of heavy when you're reading it. Symbolism aside, when you just took, say, the weather on face value of what it was being described as, everything kind of felt like it slowed things down. And the atmosphere has this kind of malevolent, pernicious agenda that humanity is not allowed to either know or even be aware of in the kind of fathomable sense that we yearn for consistently. And again, the nihilistic viewpoint comes in this idea that all of our ventures, all of our yearning for understanding, significance, meaning, it's all equaling nothing in the end. And yeah, I think that's where the kind of message of the piece comes across. Other things, to go back to the kind of racism potentially that's conveyed within this piece, or at least the tensions between the races that are involved. I'm of the position to say that Conrad most likely was a racist. I don't think he had any respect for African people at all. But at the same time, he wouldn't at this era. Like, you know, how would he even really give an opinion when he is so far removed from that culture that it would almost be an insult to, you know, to proffer his own insights, unless it was, you know, through the voyages that he describes in this piece. But again, I don't actually think the novella itself is racist, with maybe one exception, that it does depersonalize African people, and it dehumanizes the inhabitants of the Congo especially, mainly because you don't really get to know any African characters, and when they do speak, it's in kind of monosyllabic, poorly grammatical English, which, I mean, English isn't even their first language anyway, so why shouldn't it be? But at the same time, that does kind of lend itself a kind of condescending outlook, if you want to look at it that way. Whereas I really wouldn't overall. I actually found that the savages that are sitting on a boat going along the Thames in London are no different to the savages that are featured within a story that is taking place in the Congo. And though you could argue certain elements might be a bit more this way or that way, at the same time, it doesn't really judge it. There are certain tribes within this piece that are cannibalistic, and are quite savage. Like, you can't really give any understanding towards them, I wouldn't say, because it would be too arrogant. But at the same time, Conrad feels like he's everywhere and nowhere in this novel. You can feel his presence throughout. Again, back to the symbolism. It's all this kind of, it's there, but it's not there. This constant thing in the atmosphere, this evil lurking within, which is essentially just humanity. To go a bit back to the plot, the Marlowe character tells this story of how he was travelling through the Congo, and essentially he's there for colonial reasons. But then this hearsay kind of gets into his mind about this man called Kurtz. And he's been there a number of years, and he's kind of become this legendary figure. And he's talked about a lot during the piece, but he's actually only featured towards its latter end. I would say, 20 or 30 pages towards the end, he comes into the story. And even the way he's seen is through binoculars. And it gives this kind of distance throughout. And because of the legend that kind of comes up during the whole piece of him and of his mythological presence almost, he's also lended this symbolic, incomprehensible element where he's kind of inhuman, I would say. It's like he's almost like a deity, but at the same time a demonic one. So Marlowe has a very conflicting outlook of him. He kind of admires him, but only in a way which I guess people of the era might call God-fearing in a sense. It's like it might have respect for the man in question, but at the same time there's a loathing and a kind of resentment towards him as well. And the guy has really enforced his way of thinking and of being, and he's managed to survive on this place, and he's obsessed with ivory. And there's this kind of Faustian storytelling technique that's used, where he's kind of given his whole life for this idea of ivory and of what it accumulates to. And he's worried that his own group of people are just going to steal it, or any group might just take it, when really it was him who took all the risk of getting to that point and of obtaining it kind of thing. So there is this obsessive element to it, which is all kind of, I mean, the whole ivory trade is evil within itself, I would say, but the way he obsessively goes after it is also kind of something pernicious, and there's something quite, I don't know, there's a discomfiture and a disquiet that is conveyed throughout it, which is certainly conveyed throughout the whole piece. But for a novella, it feels like a long read. It's one of those ones where you have to kind of, I think, when I next read it, I'll enjoy it a lot more. Mainly because you have to not only get over the dialect elements, but also understand that it's kind of asking you to fill in the gaps where Marlowe kind of fucks up, essentially, or where he doesn't have the vocabulary, let's say, to convey what he's trying to articulate. So there's a kind of, I don't know, I found that kind of highlighted the emptiness of it all as well. It's just like there's a desperation throughout the whole piece. And on the plus side of that, the imagery that is brought about through the prose and through the narration is beautiful at times, and harrowingly so in other elements. But yeah, you got some real like images pop up into your mind where you're just kind of like, this place sounds like hell. Like, and I do wonder whether the nightmarish element was in fact trying to depict hell, or maybe even suggesting that hell lives within us and that there's no escaping it. And how maybe innocence is just a kind of illusion that we try to grapple onto, or to at least hold onto in some element, but maybe it never really exists in the first place, especially as we come to realize ourselves. As we get older, we become self-aware, and then it's like the horror isn't really through the actions of people's known or unknown. It's more that they're relatable on a human level, and that isn't exactly something we want to admit to ourselves a lot of the time. That's it. I'm going to leave it at that. It's a short piece, but it doesn't feel it when you read it. It isn't the easiest to get into. That was my experience, at least. But if you persevere with it, I think you'll find that it does linger within you. There's something about what it conveys and what it suggests, be it the heart of darkness that kind of the title does insinuate. But also, there's a power in that. It kind of raises it above. So there was a Nigerian writer, Achibi, I think his name was. I might be mispronouncing that. Who was heavily critical, mainly for the reasons I just gave, actually, especially of the dehumanizing element of the novel, or at least that his perceiving of that. But again, I think it describes racial tensions and the horrors of colonialism. But I think it goes above that. And I would say that it doesn't really suggest that before the white man's arrival in the Congo, that's exactly how it was, this kind of dark element that's always lingering around, and of this savage inhabitants. But more that potentially it was the white man's arrival that actually made that come about. So again, I think there is a kind of schism throughout the piece where you can look at it from both sides and see its point, which again serves to raise it above any normal kind of idea of literature and of what it was trying to convey in the first place. So, sorry, I was distracted then. There's a window cleaner there. Anyway, I'm going to go. Let me know what you think of Heart of Darkness. It is famous and infamous at the same time for a reason. Let me know what you thought of it when you gave it a read for the first time. What did you take from it? What was the strengths, weaknesses? Did you loathe it? Maybe you were meant to. I'm not sure you're supposed to enjoy this piece, really. But I can already feel it living within me almost. It's like the kind of journeys now are kind of travelling through my veins, which is a testament to its power. I can say that much at least. Anyway, I'll see you next week. Thank you very much for watching this. Adios.